Oh, we already are. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the April 24th instance of our SIG Docs meeting. On the agenda today, I pasted it in chat, but we have one item, and that is to talk about composition, WAC, and discovering components in the component book. Namely, Danny put up a pull request in SIG Docs in the component book about to cover kind of that content. And so I think that's one of the areas we want to discuss today. And then before we move further, does anyone else have any other agenda items that they want to add to the agenda for today? Great. Then I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Danny. Do we have someone who is passionate about taking notes today? I can go ahead and do it. I haven't done it in a while, so I'll I'll be the keeper of the keys. Okay, off to you, Danny.
Cool. Yeah, so I opened a pull request into the component book. I can drop a link to it in a moment, except for my computer's doing something weird. There we go. Um, there we go. Cool. Thanks. So, yeah, it basically adds stuff, and then I actually went ahead and spun it up locally because um, if we wanted to like look at the changes at all and like discuss them at all here. But basically, it adds a section to distributing components that mentions the fact that there is the org registry, that there is the WIT CLI that can interact with org registries. That cargo component can interact with org registries, and that WAC can interact with org registries. Um, and then I updated quite a bit in the Rust section to actually talk about like how to use WAC, as well as the composing component section to talk about how to use WAC, and the tutorial to use WAC as well. Um, and yeah, so it's generally like encouraging people to use those tools with the registry when they're like performing compositions, but it does like link in a couple places, I think, to the WAC README where you can use like local binaries instead of the registry if you want to do that as well. And yeah, I guess this stuff probably can't get merged yet because there are a couple of pull requests outstanding in a couple of different code bases that would make it so that these commands, basically all these commands only work like when you're using your own namespace today. And once these other pull requests get merged, then you should just like by default be able to use any namespace for a package, period. So I figured we wouldn't like try to get this merged until then. I think the biggest like outstanding things that I like haven't decided about this pull request yet are like if we should still encourage people to use Wasm Compose and or the Wasm Builder app, and if like those intend to be maintained or if we like intend to yeah, just kind of tell people that WAC is like the way that everybody should go about performing their compositions. Because I think that maybe some of the docs, like some of the examples, were initially written without like before WAC existed, and so like maybe we would even want to like change some of the examples given that WAC exists now. Yeah, Kate, what's up?
I think Wasm Builder.app, the UI, I don't see there having been a replacement for that with WAC. Do you see there having been a replacement for kind of a drag and drop experience around composition?
I think that there hasn't been a replacement for it, but I also think that like having talked to Peter relatively recently, like I think that he thinks that like basically Wasm Builder takes Wasm Compose and does a J-code transpile on it. And I think the thought is that like maybe now you would want to do a J-code transpile on like a WAC library instead of on Wasm Compose. So there's that. I do know that like we kind of also for wa.dev have like the thought that like anywhere that an import interface is happening, you may want to browse existing implementation components and like have some like mechanics for composition, but like not totally sure what they're going to look like yet. But yeah, cool. So I guess I'm hearing don't remove the part from Wasm Builder, but it is likely that it's going to change to use WAC instead of Wasm Compose. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but perhaps yeah, do we want to not tell people to use where we're encouraging people to use Wasm tools? Is that like something that belongs in the component model book, or is that like a little like low level at this point? Yeah,
Just quick thought on that. Kind of rule of thumb, maybe that we can try and hold ourselves to, and I don't know how practical this will be in practice, but like it's going to be impossible to kind of or not really ideal in the component book to try and explain how to use every tool that exists for every use case and every scenario. And I think, in fact, we want to sort of have most people go to the home pages of those tools and read their own documentation for how to use them. But what I do see as a part of the component model book is kind of explaining the high level concepts and using those using tools and creative ways in order to like explain and illustrate those concepts. Um, so one example of that, for instance, for composing components, I think it would be really interesting for us to show like a very simple example and say like we have two components and we want to compose them together where one exports something that the other imports and we put them together using WAC. And for full disclosure, I have a PR on WAC that's about to be merged that does as a CLI tool for doing kind of that very simple scenario. It's called WAC plug um, for plugging components together. And I would love to see that used there because that's meant to be sort of the, very easy and most straightforward way to do composition. And then we can say things like, if you have more complex scenarios, then you can look into WAC, which has a full language for describing how to do composition. And here's a link to the WAC repos documentation on how to do that. And if we're unsatisfied with the WAC repos documentation, then we should go there and make changes to it there rather than changing the component book.
cool. Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. Yeah.
I guess a follow-up there, Ryan, do you think that having an example where we do use do more complex composition with WAC, it should not be in the component book and we should leave that to WAC docs, or should we also like because our current examples, for example, with the calculator, we can use WAC for.
Um, I mean, I think we should use whatever we think kind of illustrates the concept and gets people to understand the concept without having to explain the tool itself on too deep of a level. And that's, I don't know what the balance is there exactly because one bleeds into the other, obviously. Um, but like ideally, in an ideal world, we would have this calculator example and we wouldn't need to use the WAC language at all for that. We could just use kind of simple CLI commands for doing composition for that example, and then just hint towards the fact that there's a full language there and the tutorial inside of WAC for how to do that. I don't know if that's going to be practical, and maybe we do have to use the WAC language for these examples. But sort of my gut says, like, as much as we can get away from having to do that, the better, because we're not here to explain the tools. We're here to explain component concepts.
And by a bunch of CLI commands, do you mean using WASM tools compose?
So it's my understanding that WASM tool, I shouldn't say it's my understanding. When talking with Peter, we have come to sort of an informal agreement that, we haven't created an issue yet, and so everybody's free to change their mind. But when I talked to Peter, and I think Danny and Calvin were there for this as well, we talked about the future of WASM tools compose, and it was either full deprecation and removal from WASM tools or replacement with WAC in some ways, where WASM tools compose is some sort of alias for a subset of WAC functionality. But WAC is a separate, WASM tools compose is a separate tool from WAC. I think it doesn't have much of a future.
I guess I was just clarifying what you meant by a bunch of CLI commands instead of using the WAC language.
Yeah, so WAC is not only the WAC language and the WAC encode CLI invocation that just parses the WAC language and does the composition that you have written inside of the WAC language. With the pull requests that I have open now, we're moving also towards having sort of common composition scenarios as CLI quick commands, so that you don't have to write WAC language at all. You just say WAC, and for the plug one, it's like WAC plug my component with exports into my component with import is basically what it looks like.
That makes sense. So what I'm hearing is we basically would wait for those PRs to go in, a release of WAC, and then in the component book, every time we use WASM tools compose, instead we use WAC plug. And then we say, hey, if you're doing a more complex composition and you don't want to do a series of WAC plugs, WAC has a language for describing composition, read these docs.
Yeah. Yes. And then like one more thing to say about that I think is like slightly tangential to what we've been talking about, but I think is super important for this group, is if we're doing something where we're trying to document the thing and we find that documenting the flow is really hard because the flow is complicated, like we shouldn't be afraid to then go back to the tools and say, the tools are complicated. Is there some way that we can make this flow easier because we're having a hard time documenting it? And allow the documentation process to also improve the tools themselves, so that at some point we come to an equilibrium where we're documenting things that look easy because they are easy.
So I only briefly looked at your PR, Danny. So I'd be curious how much of it, I do know there were sections where the WAC, you did have some WAC text in there. And so I don't know how much of a deviation it is from what you're working on, but I do know it probably didn't consider WAC plug, so it might be kind of different from what you had.
Yeah, I'm thinking everything that Ryan's saying makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm also, well, I think one thing that I'm curious about is if you've been using the registry features for the WAC plug PR currently, and if it's like if plug has been like used against a registry at all yet. Yeah, but I mean, I'm guessing that
Sorry,
it
I was just
probably.
going to say it doesn't have registry support yet, so we would need to have that first.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess like yeah, a lot of the what is in the PR2 is like viewing WAC as the easiest way to interact with the registry and like grab components that are out there publicly like available for everybody. But but I wouldn't suspect that it would be very challenging to get those to get the plug to get Whack plug to like use the registry because in Whack is like using the registry without my PRs at all. It's simply like a matter of like how much configuration you have to do to use namespaces other than like your personal namespace is like really what's getting fixed by the PRs that I have open. So my guess is that it would probably be pretty little work for plug to leverage the registry. There is like well, I guess there were like a few things that I was thinking about though. That maybe it could be easiest to like share my screen and like just like show some of the like docs that I have. Um, and I know that like we were just talking. That's yeah, okay, cool. Like about not including whack. So maybe the answer is just like we don't include whack, but I also feel like whack kind of like enables you to think about things that like weren't present in the examples like prior. So like there's a part of me that like wants, and maybe the answer is that like this stuff gets added to the whack readme. Like I don't know. But like definitely before, I think like there wasn't a distinction between like components that implement a world in a WIT package and like, sorry, the concepts were distinguished from each other, but you can have a published package that is the WIT package, or you can have a published package that is an implementation of a world. And so like I feel like we were talking basically like I think that like we were using, well, first of all, I think WIT used to not require you to name worlds, but now it does. And so I think like the worlds weren't named, and so you could like uh use the same namespace colon name combination to talk about both the like what is being implemented and the actual implementation of it. And so I felt like there was some niceness going on with like whack I don't know, being able to like be a reason to distinguish between like, hey, this is how you would use a WIT package that's been like that is publicly viewable on a registry and able to be interacted with, and this is how you would use WAC to like interact with an implementation of a world defined in a WIT package. So there was that, and then because of this, and because like I guess also in the tutorial, um, like I also changed the namespace of everything to be Bytecode Alliance. And I wasn't sure. So I'm also, right, there's like a preview version of the registry and a production version of the registry. And I published everything to Bytecode Alliance under the preview version because I wasn't sure if we like what we need to do if we wanted to like actually put these in production and like have them like be, you know, if there should be any like formalities around that. But so when people actually like do the fulfilled imports, they can like yes, they can author their own component, but they can also just like go grab a component on the registry and like or they can like edit a whack file, like use like copy this whack file, use a component that's already been like created for them to perform their composition with, and then like publish their own version of like the same like an alternative implementation of the same component and swap it out for the one that they authored, right? So that was here. And then the only other thing with that is like in these examples, we have like two different WIT packages, which like historically, like you're working with WIT on your local file system. I guess what I'm getting at is there's like a little bit of a difference between the WIT in the like Rust examples and in the tutorials. And in the tutorials, we have like a single WIT package to make things simple, but we have like two WIT packages in like Rust. And I kind of liked that there were two packages in the Rust example because you actually get to like have two distinct things deployed to a registry that like reference each other. And we can show that like those things reference each other. But then over here, we actually just like throw them all inside of like a single one. And so I was like, you know, debating how we want to publish things to the registry that we encourage people to use. But also this could get like way simplified if we decide that this is like beyond scope and that like this kind of like information belongs in the WAC docs instead of in the component model book. But anywho, I know I probably just did like a lot of things, but like these are like the places where I've like thought that this was open to design and discussion. And I know that I have a lot more context on it too, because it probably like takes time to like read it and like grok what the whole like workflow is. But yeah.
I think going back to Ryan's point of our examples and tools should explain the concepts. I think one thing I like about WAC in its textual form is that it shows, like it says the words that can be so wordy to say, of like this component imports from this component and exports from this component, and it's saying that all in its own textual way. And for that reason, I do think it could be useful to have an example with WAC in the book instead of me trying in text to explain that, having that do that for me. So I could see that being very useful. I also think the component books role is to be one place for people to discover everything. And so I do think we want to discuss how registries fit into this story. Um, and so doing that in the way that is most native of an experience. So whatever way people are using registries with composition, we should be demonstrating there. And then to your point, Danny, of having one um having one package for our example versus multiple. I think there's also a rule we could establish that like you want some level of complexity in an example so that they don't hit that extra level of complexity when they go do it on their own. And that, yeah, it is probably somewhat rare that you're only using one package when you're using composition. So maybe using multiple would be a good example.
Yeah, I think what I like landed on there, yeah, there's still like a few places where I was like, is this the thing that makes sense or is this the thing that makes sense? But I think another thing that I noticed is we have this like calculator example like everywhere. And then like in the section where we just like talk about composition, we like there's this like regex like set of like components that like we talk about hypothetically composing with each other, and then we're like you would run this command for in like wasm compose to compose them, or you would like go use wasm builder like in order to compose these two things. But I don't know that we actually like concretely like show them like how to like do those things. It's more like this is wasm composed, you could use this on these wit files without like specifically referencing those specific interfaces in the wasm compose, or also and it's also the yeah there's like a balance with like how much we like just like reference people off to like go look at the docs like for the other tools and stuff. But I was thinking about publishing implementations of the regex stuff as well, because I um yeah, so that's it. But I do feel like I guess there's a thing too, which is like I think I found myself like adding information about like having multiple instances of a single component for the first time, because I feel like WAC really like lends itself towards instantiating one component multiple times and like giving one instance to this component and a different instance to this other component. And so um it does feel like there are like component model concepts that become illuminated when using whack a bit in the language. And I don't know the best way to balance that with like trying to make things simple for people. But yeah. I guess though, like, well, yeah, if anybody has time to like check out the stuff that I provided, one thing is like, I mean, also just confirming that like the things that I'm instructing people work for other people, which kind of maybe were a little bit too early because the PR you would have to use the branches in the pull requests that I have. So you'd have to use like a local build if you like actually tried to like go through the workflows that like I created. But so maybe I will, and I think that it probably makes sense to like read things now and see if like the text makes sense. And then like hopefully I can make some progress on all these pull requests so that way just like the latest installs of WAC warg cargo component with are usable in these flows. And then yeah. Kate.
Kind of on that note of timeline, do we have a sense of when all these tools, so WAC plug and then your changes to WAC, Danny, to support and cargo components and support registries will be in? So kind of understanding when this discussion and decision needs to come about.
Um yeah, I mean, this is kind of like mostly where my head is right now. I know Lan just left another comment on the warg stuff that is because Warg is a dependency of all of the CLIs so the WIT CLI, the cargo component, and WAC all depend on Warg. And I'm making changes to the underlying Warg thing and consuming those changes in all of those. And I know that me and Lan have a little bit more back and forth to do on the Warg aspect of things, but I would love to see these pull requests beginning to, and yeah, this week or next week, I would suspect would be a reasonable estimate. I don't know if that sounds reasonable to you, Brian, but I guess the other thing too is that like Peter has distanced himself and he's been like involved in a lot of these things. So like generally it was like some of this stuff was like, hey, Peter, do you want to review this? And now like that's kind of changing a bit, but yeah.
Ryan, do you have a sense of whack plug, the timeline of that? Because I see that as almost prerequisite, or maybe it might be in parallel. But changing all of WASM tools compose references to whack plug would seems like a very scoped um, issue, which we could even put up an issue for on component docs.
Yeah, the PR should probably land today whenever Peter gets online. I just had some nits that I had to address while he was sleeping, and they've been addressed. That doesn't have registry support yet, so that would have to be a follow-on. But for local composition, where the components are local, that should be done today.
Yeah, honestly, given the way that I think WAC works, I wouldn't be surprised if the registry stuff just came for free. Like, I think that like Warg might just recognize that there's like a namespace in a package, and if you have the feature flag set up, plug might actually it might just come for free. So I'd be curious actually to see whether that happens or not. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of an assumption in plug itself that it literally tries to read from disk first um, before any of the like any whack graph stuff even sees anything. So like we'll have to change that. But like I just need or if anybody here wants to take a look at that, I'm happy to have more eyes on that as well. But I'll definitely get around to it probably tomorrow or the day after if nobody else does.
Cool.
I have a general question wearing the overall SIG documentation hat, which is about this aggregate collection of documentation in general, right? We have the component book, which is a thing. And then it seems like everything else mostly has some markdown in its repo. Maybe it's the README. So when we talk about, WAC tools documentation or the WAC documentation, that's really what we mean. And that's what we're pointing people off at. Is that how we imagine that's going to be? As with our looking in the aggregate set of documentation for WebAssembly for developers, do we imagine some of these other things being more separately, comprehensively documented in some other way? Are we mostly, when we refer to these other documents, we're talking about READMEs and repos, or maybe single markdown files in repos? Because in part, I think this fits back in with the earlier conversation about, well, how much do we put in the component model book? And then at some point, we point off at other documentation. Here's a basic introduction to WASM Tools Compose. If you want to understand this better, go read the WASM Tools Compose documentation, and having the user flows and everything else kind of, how much is in here in the component model book, composing two components. That sounds, and so just, and this isn't a question we have to answer now, but I think there's some amount of thinking too here in that, which is like, how do we decide? It seems like this is the right group to have an opinion on that. And so how do we get to a point where we have that opinion? Do we imagine someday we might reach out to the WAC folks and say, you really need a book about WAC, or you need some other documentation other than a single markdown file in your repo? Let's talk about that. So.
Well, interestingly, yeah, I mean, I think, and with WAC specifically, like it was mostly like Peter's thing, and he's like been less involved. So like, I actually feel like I have a pull request open to it. Brian Hardick has a pull request, I think, and Ryan has one. Like, so like the WAC folks are largely us at this point, I guess. So, you know, there's that. But I do think that, yeah, basically there's, I think all of these tools that are probably going to be like major parts of how people like get work done on a day-to-day basis, as it makes sense to cover simple cases here, but then there will be more complicated cases in them that like are described more thoroughly in the GitHub readmes.
Yeah, I just don't want to lose a good train of thought if we have some conversation that says, well, this part we should put in the component model book, and then it should bridge off to this other stuff, which should be in the documentation for this other thing. And then make sure we have the conversation with however that documentation for that other thing is getting produced to say, okay, well, let's make sure there's a good landing spot. We're going to cover things adequately and be the discovery resource for people. And then having discovered it, they're going to want to obviously eventually know more. And we can kind of make sure we don't lose both ends of that connection. So Kate's got her hand up.
Yeah, I think one of the assumed things that we've said a couple times is the component model book will have an intro to the concept, and then the tool will have a more complicated example. The assumption there being that the tool has a complicated example. What I've seen in tooling and open source tools is that you still have very simple examples. Like I'd imagine that it's basically a hello world in both. And in fact, the more complicated example would maybe be in the component book, because usually when you're documenting something, you don't want to prescribe behavior, you want to introduce. And so I don't know, but we can create a different standard. And I think that's a question, is like, to be a Bytecode Alliance tool, repository, whatever, what is the documentation standard? Do we expect you to have a README with these sections? Do you have this level of examples? And obviously, open source developers and contributors shouldn't feel obligated to meet so many different demands, but maybe as a documentation sake, having these criteria, it would free people up to go ahead and submit PRs to help those repositories get to a certain standard. I guess from what you were saying, Danny, of you, Ryan, and Brian being some of the people who are the main, transitioning into maintainership for WAC, how would you feel about the fact if someone put a PR in that was a WAC example, that was a tutorial that walked through composing 3 different components, and submitting that as a PR to the WAC repository itself?
I think there probably already is one. Also is something
Not really. There's not really a ton of
okay.
examples there. There's an issue for opening
Yeah.
examples. So it's definitely something that I think would be viewed favorably.
Yeah. And I
And what I
can
like it. Sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I can consider like maybe some of the stuff that I like mentioned in the PR for the component model book could depend, like could make, there's this whole other thing too, which is like registry documentation and how much of it belongs on the registry versus like in various pieces of tooling, right? Or in the component model book. So yeah, but yeah, I'm specifically in the like part where I like go over using a WAC file in the composing components section of the book. That stuff could easily, I think, make its way over there. There is like a whole other thing too, which is like WIT packages. You have like namespace : name / I think people generally think of the thing after the slash as being an interface, but it can actually like there are certain tools that expect that to be a world. And like, I don't know, I tried really hard to like concisely like break out each of these things in like the composing components section and found that it was like still wordy no matter how I like arranged it. So I'm curious how to make these concepts most clear for people, and it might, and maybe putting it in the WAC documentation is something that should be considered. Sorry, that was a little long-winded, but yeah.
No, I think you're in a great place, Danny, to maybe set a precedent because especially with WAC kind of polishing off, to have this be a moment to do what Ryan was saying of like have all that documentation and those examples in WAC. And if we do a push of kind of your changes and put those into WAC as examples and try to reference those from the component book and see what that feels like. Because that could be the first time we kind of tried to make that bigger transition of pointing out to more verbose examples and then not explaining as much about the specific tool within the component book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is like a thing that I've been feeling, which is like I'm the only person who's used any of these tools to interact with the registry, kind of. And Peter like set it up to use the registry, but like there was like a reference implementation that without like any discoverability like at all, right? So he was like using a local server. And I guess like some of the other tools, like cargo component, kind of like assumes that you use this like target flag where you're referencing WIT packages that have been published in the registry, and like WAC kind of like has assumptions, I think, about like being able to know that the components that you're using target specific worlds. And I don't know if like a composition being done in such a way where it expects things to be implementations of public facing WIT packages is like, yeah, I guess I just like don't know the best way to like share the mental model that I've developed from like using the tools in the combination that I have with like others, and like seeing if like these ideas like make sense to other people as well. But anyways, yeah, I'm happy to like, or yeah, this is I think there's a first iteration of it in the existing PR, and I'm like curious to like hear feedback from people and if it belongs in the WAC. But then yeah.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you saying is that that PR is two things. One, it is bringing WAC into the component book, which is what we're saying may be good to put into WAC. And the other thing it's doing is bringing in the concept of registries and easily composing with remote packages and remote components to the component book. So two different discussions there. One seems pretty resolved that it could fit in WAC. The other feels like we aren't talking about registries enough in general in the component book. And I don't even know if we mentioned org. I think we might, but you would know because you just sifted through all the docs. But I think that's a fair call out, especially because the story and the experience could be very smooth, especially for what you were saying with regex of like, okay, now go build and run this. Instead, we could just say use the remote component and run it. So maybe that means this PR should be broken up into two that address those two different issues. And I wonder if we want to have a discussion on whether we need like a section specifically on WARG or on registries. And it's not necessarily about plugging registry into every example that's already there. Because those ideally, if we're following Ryan's rule, are explaining a concept already. And it's instead about having a new concept, which is called registries, and maybe a WARG page that talks through how each of these tools connect to registries and gives a blurb and points out to ideally where that's documented for each individual tool as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so I think there was like basically like one pair there, and there is a page on distributing components that like mentioned the WARG protocol, and I updated that, and in it I mentioned like these are the 3 CLI tools that know how to interact with the registry. I do think that like WAC is the like big like cohesive like I feel like you can like the WIT CLI is a way to like scaffold things out and create things that encourage other people to use things that have been scaffolded out. And then cargo component can be like, hey, like here is like the base of a project, given that I want to author an implementation of this WIT package that is like already published and like exists. WAC really is the like closest thing you have to like what you expect of a cargo toml or like a package JSON. I think like not get granted, it's definitely like much more expressive than like either of those things are, but like it's the closest thing to, hey, I just want this other utility to be available in this component that I'm like authoring. So it is like hard for me to like envision how to encourage people to depend on other public facing utilities without like WAC and the registry in tandem being like, yeah, like very like documented like closely together. But yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is like, if we put whack text in the component book, it is a very clear extension to that to then be like, hey, if you want to use a remote package, this is how your whack text slightly changes. And now all of a sudden it's using a package that it can access remotely.
And I think, well, and really the cool thing is like basically with WAC, you can like flags or config determine whether you want, like when you see namespace colon package name, it's either gonna like go automatically go try to get that thing from the registry or go to a local file depending on like how you've configured like WAC or what flags you're like including in your WAC command. So, but yeah. You could likely not change the WAC at all and have it use local files in one situation in the registry, like in another.
I guess my clarifying question, is there any reason that should not exist in whack documentation?
And I think it does to some extent, but yeah, I think concrete examples are probably lacking. So maybe that is like the thing to maybe the regex stuff belongs in WAC docs.
Yeah, I guess what I was getting at there is maybe a clear action item. Our next meeting's in 2 weeks. It sounds like these PRs are going to go in. Maybe clear action items are document those new features in WAC with examples. And then we regroup next meeting and see like, do we also want to bring those concrete examples into the component book, or what is a way we could point to those or give different examples? But if we all think that that should be documented in with examples in the WAC repo anyways, that could be a starter and inform what we do in the component book so there's not too much redundancy, but maybe elaboration, if anything.
Yeah. Is there, I guess just also if we are encouraging people like in examples to grab specific things out of the registry, is there a namespace that like we know is the one that we should publish these like components to? Because right now I have them as bytecode dash alliance. And again, this is in the preview registry, not in production, because I figured this should be a group conversation. I know I saw Calvin mentioned earlier that he thought maybe component book makes more sense. But I guess if it's like a WAC, if the example's in the WAC README, then I don't know if component book would make sense, but it could.
Is there a way to do like I think if it's bytecode alliance and then just immediately regex, maybe that's too much of a, directly, but if we can have component book in there somewhere.
Yeah. Or I guess like really, is there any like thing that would need to be done? Like if we were publishing things under the bytecode alliance namespace, is there any like concern about like if BA wants those packages endorsed as like BA owned projects or not, yeah.
We probably don't want to clutter that namespace with like examples of stuff too that are
Like
more
if that was where WASM tools like things end up being published, like is that also where we want like hello world things for tutorials kind of
yeah. So yeah, I think things that are examples and should be like in some other namespace.
Bytecode alliance examples or bytecode alliance docs, something like that could work. But I guess and those would just be for anything that a bytecode alliance project is referencing would be the idea.
yeah, or just like in the like tutorials that like in the component book right now, I'm like, hey, like if you reference this in your WAC file, it's going to grab this component and like link to the page that like the component has been published to. So I can, right now I'm doing it all under like the non-production registry instance. So like, you know, I guess it doesn't like need to be finalized until like we're telling users to expect the things to be on the production registry. But yeah, so I'll probably just keep using the non-production one until, and then probably the decision will be made when we actually decide to merge this stuff. But yeah.
Is this a question we should poke the TSC about?
Maybe not necessarily for this particular, like
Or
the docs
propose
topic,
something
but
just to get them to weigh in
yeah.
and say, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I'd say that's a conversation that would be good to have sooner than later about like publishing BA projects.
Yeah,
Uh,
and it would be good if we could make a recommendation or something and say, hey, if you know, we're planning to do this, stop us if you think it's not a good idea. So,
yeah, it's worth noting that the functionality right now, you can have multiple like owners of a namespace and like give people full permission. So it's not like one person controls the thing, right? So you have like full access control scenarios. And you do have the ability to make things private. So, and control, like, you know, if you wanted to work on something before it was, you're ready to share it publicly.
right. Those are all good things. And I think there's more about, we want to pick something and start using it. And it's going to grow over time and spread across multiple projects. And we like to make sure that we pick the right thing. Everybody's comfortable with what we're going to use. So.
You know, it's like a similar way to like how we're publishing things to crates, right, for BA projects. So, and obviously using GitHub. So,
And your question is just what is the package name, right? Like, because what your point there is you can have multiple work registries hosting that package. We just need to decide on the like package name structure.
Or the namespace really. Like yeah. Because you'll have a bunch of packages under like a common namespace. And if we thought of like there being a BA namespace that is like BA tooling that like is like public, hey, this is where like various tools have been published to. Is there one that we should not publish examples to? Or yeah.
Okay. Um, just to kind of summarize, seems like if we were to capture action items, it would be try to document these new features in WAC. If we're talking about the documentation side of things, try to document these new additions to WAC within the WAC repository. Offline, everyone kind of think of what namespace would be good for general bytecode alliance examples, documentation, whatever, and maybe come up with a prevailing example to present to the TOC with. As like, does this seem like an appropriate namespace for examples and also for general bytecode alliance projects? Any other action items that people would call out?
I don't know if it's an action item, but Danny's going to provide air traffic control or watch all these other PRs that are flying around, and at least give us some idea when they've all landed, such that it would simplify life for his PR on the component
Yeah,
model book, and we could circle back around and have more of a conversation at that point, maybe.
they're also all linked to the component model book. But yeah, and then one of them still needs to be reviewed. Yeah, there's still like a little bit more back and forth that needs to happen on a couple of them. But yeah, I'll definitely be trying to get them all landed myself. So yeah.
Great. Well, I think we can call that and just feel free to add agenda items for next meeting once we get close to that.
Cool.
Talk to y'all next time.